Am I on? Yes, I am. Hello. Good morning. It's going to get. I'm going to get a reputation because I finished my last sermon with a song, and I'm going to start this one with a song as well. But before I do, does anyone know what happened on the 28th of November 2013? Matthew, do you know what happened on the 28th of November 2013? 28th of November 2013, Matthew was commissioned as vicar of our parishes. 8 years. You've got to keep up with me, Jude. I'm going to move. So, to our topic this morning. Wherever you go, whatever you do, I will be right here waiting for you. Whatever it takes, or how my heart breaks, I will be right here waiting for you. Richard Marx, the American singer and songwriter, wrote those words to his then girlfriend. The story goes that his actress girlfriend was in South Africa filming, and he hadn't seen her for several months. He tried to get a visa to travel across to see her, but his application was refused. So when he got back home, he sat down and he wrote the words to this song as a way of expressing his feelings and his love for her. He says it actually only took him 20 minutes to write the entire song, music included. He then recorded it and sent it across on tape to South Africa. It was never the plan for him to actually release it as a song. As he said, it was a deeply personal one, meant for just his girlfriend. However, after being persuaded by friends, he released the song in 1989. And it wasn't a bad decision, because it reached #1 in the American charts and #2 in Great Britain. The song obviously worked as well, because his girlfriend then became his wife. Why start this morning by talking about an American songwriter, a love song that he wrote for his girlfriend? Well, that's this morning what we're looking at in our reading from Hosea. A love song to us from God. Much of Hosea is written as poetry. It's his prophetic word to the northern kingdom of Israel a few years before they were invaded by the Assyrians and taken into exile. Our focus this morning is on chapter 2, which falls right in the middle, obviously, of the first three chapters, that tells us a little bit about the history and the life of Hosea. But more about that in a minute. First, can we have our reading, please, from Hosea? Thank you, Vicky.
Our first reading is from Hosea chapter 2, starting at verse 14. Therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. Then I will give her back her vineyards and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the olive oil. And they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. This is the word of the Lord.
So as I've explained, the first 3 chapters of Hosea are a short recap of his life's story. They tell of his broken marriage to Gomer. Now, Hosea's story is actually quite awful. As prophets go, I think he had one of the roughest deals. God chose to use his life as a real-life parable of his relationship, God's relationship, to the nation of Israel, and ultimately to us. Hosea's wife, Gomer, was unfaithful. Whether before or after they were married, it's not quite clear in the Bible, but she was referred to as a promiscuous woman or harlot, depending on the translation that you read. So Hosea chapter 1 verse 2, go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So, Hosea and Gomer were married. They had 3 children before their marriage fell apart, and she left with another man. However, despite her unfaithfulness, God tells Hosea to find her, pay her debts, and once again declare his love for her. On the surface, then, this seems like Hosea definitely got the rough end of the deal. Being an adulteress was actually punishable by stoning under Jewish law. On top of sparing her this fate, then, he had to pay a debt that he couldn't even afford to pay the full price of in cash. So he had to make up the value with barley. So what was the going rate for an adulteress in the time of Hosea? Well, it was about 170 grams of silver and 195 kilos of barley. That's what Hosea ended up paying. It was, in actual fact, the price that he would have had to have paid for a female slave. So, what we have here is a prophet of God who, rather than just proclaiming God's word to his people, had his entire personal life used as a prophetic symbol. His marriage and life to Gomer tells the story of God's relationship with the nation of Israel, where God is the husband and Israel is the wife. So, if today's reading is supposed to be a love song, how does it fit with all of this? Well, what we have here in Hosea chapter 2 is God coming to Israel and declaring his love for them, just as Hosea did with his wife. To help us understand the passage and what God might have to say to us this morning, I want to look at it in 3 parts. The broken relationship, the restored and renewed relationship, and the gifts of the marriage. So, how was this relationship broken? Just as Hosea's wife was a harlot and an adulteress, so too were the nation of Israel. This wasn't a new thing to the relationship between God and his people. Let's not forget, it goes all the way back to the very beginning of the Bible, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. In the beginning, the relationship between God and his people was perfect. And then came the fall. The first time we were unfaithful, deceived by a snake whispering in our ear and tempting us to go against what God had told us, breaking the one rule that we had been given. And that was just the start. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, there are stories of God's people turning away from him in favor of other, more attractive suitors, just as Gomer did with Hosea. One such suitor is mentioned in our reading this morning, the Valley of Achor. Now, can anyone remember what went so wrong in the Valley of Achor? Come on, surely someone here with all this Bible knowledge must know what happened in that valley. No? All right then, I'll tell you. So, the Valley of Achor was where Israel was unfaithful to God for the first time on arriving or entering into the Promised Land. Technically, they weren't unfaithful there, but it was where their unfaithfulness was discovered and punished. After tumbling the walls of Jericho and defeating its army, God told the Israelites to offer all of its treasures, all its gold and silver and iron, to him. However, one Israelite decided that the silver and the gold was just far too attractive and far too shiny, and so he kept some back for himself. It's in the valley of Achor where the previously undefeated Israelite army were beaten for the first time in the Promised Land. You see, after trying to capture the city of Ai, about 3,000 of the Israelite army were chased into this valley, and a few of them were killed. On asking God why it had happened, Joshua was told it was because Israel had broken the covenant promise that God had made with them. The guilty party was, in this case, a man called Achan. He was the one who had kept back some of the gold and silver from Jericho for himself. His punishment for this, and his children and his family, along with all his cattle and sheep, was to be stoned to death in the valley. Then, when they were dead, the bodies and all of the family possessions, including the gold and the silver and the iron that he had kept, were burned. As I said, the Old Testament is full of occasions where God's chosen people turned away from God to worship more attractive idols and suitors. The Baals are another example of this, and we read about them in verse 17 this morning. I will remove the names of the Baals from their lips. The Baals were the gods of the nations that the Israelites conquered on entering the Promised Land, and were, in many respects, far more attractive than God. Some of the rituals and methods of worship were more appealing to perhaps our more carnal and animal natures. However, the relationship that they demanded was extremely different from the one God asked. Interestingly, I always find a little bit of a discovery in these things. The word Baal comes from a Hebrew word, Bali, which means master. And that was the kind of relationship that these gods expected. They were the master, and we were the slaves, doing what we were told to please them, to keep them happy, for fear of what retribution they might bring on us. Now, as I explained, Hosea was prophesying to the kingdom of Israel, and it was only a few years before they were taken into exile by the Assyrians and taken to a foreign country. They had been at it again. As a nation, they had turned away from God and instead were choosing to worship the Baals, as we hear about in our reading. God has tried so many times through so many prophets, so many leaders, even giving the nations a king. He'd done it to try and change their ways. But the relationship between him and his people was completely broken. The only hope was a reset, a chance to start again, to send them from his presence in the Promised Land, in the hope that they would realize what they were missing. Israel, ignoring and leaving God, was just as Hosea's wife had left him, and all that was left was a broken relationship. So, how was this broken relationship renewed and restored? It started with God. He made the first move. He allures his wife into the wilderness and speaks tenderly to her. This is where our God differs from the Baals. They placed themselves as master. The Baals placed themselves as master over us, whereas God wants to live in relationship with us. Why resort to charming and tempting us then? Isn't there someone else who uses this as a tactic? Someone who we've already spoken about this morning. He was there in the garden, tempting us to take the fruit. And he's been doing it ever since. Charm and temptation are two of the devil's most powerful weapons, aren't they? So why is God choosing to use the same strategy? He could have, he could have been tempted to say, no, enough. I'll drag you out there so you're going to listen to me. Or I'm going to force you into the wilderness. But he doesn't. God is simply planning on outbidding the devil. Anything you can do, I can do better. You see, God has far more to offer in his bidding to charm and tempt Israel than the devil, because God's power surpasses anything that anyone else can offer. But how did Israel know that his intentions were true? Because he told them that after he leads them into the wilderness, he will speak tenderly to them. Or perhaps a more accurate translation would be, speak to their hearts. Israel would have been able to see through the actions of Hosea that God was prepared to do all of the hard work, to pay whatever price was necessary in order to restore and renew the relationship between him and his chosen people. He wanted them to be his bride. He doesn't want slaves who worship him out of fear for what vengeance he might reap upon them. He desired for them to have a loving relationship with him. He shows his commitment to them in verse 19 to 20. If you've got it in front of you, have a look. How many times does he tell them that he will betroth them? Not once forever, not twice in righteousness and justice, but 3 times he tells them he will betroth them in love and compassion and faithfulness. And what would Israel do? They would acknowledge or know him. What did he mean when he said Israel would know him? I wonder, is it the same know as when Adam knew Eve and conceived Cain? Genesis 4 verse 1. Or is it the same know as when Joseph knew not Mary until she had given birth? Matthew 1 verse 25. Both of these speak of a very intimate physical relationship between those two parties. Is that the know that God wanted for his people? He wants to restore and renew that broken relationship between him and his people, whatever it took. So now that this broken relationship has been renewed and restored, what were the gifts given in celebration of the marriage? Well, for starters, that valley where judgment had taken place against the Israelites in the time of Joshua would become a door of hope, it tells us. A door that would lead Israel back to the land that they had been promised by God. Just as when they first came out of Egypt with Moses. Israel would once again know the presence of God with them as they had before. They would know what it was to be in close communion with God and to receive the intimate love and compassion that only he can give. The relationship would be reset as it was in the beginning in the garden. Bow and sword and war will be abolished, we're told, so that they may lie next to each other in peace. God promises that never again will the relationship be broken. However, this time, the presence in celebration of the remarriage included wedding favours for all the guests. Just look at verse 23. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And how will the guests at the wedding respond to their gifts? They will say, you are my God. So, not just gifts for the bride and groom, but also for the guests. Who were the guests? Well, that's going to be us. But before we think about the meaning of this for us, let's hear our second reading from Luke.
second reading is from Luke chapter 15, starting at verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to the father, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Vicky. It's probably quite a well-known reading and story for most of us. A story that's actually not dissimilar from the story of Hosea's life or of Israel's journey with God. The son leaving a relationship where there is nothing but love and desire for the best for him. But he thinks there's something better and far more appealing for him out there. When he gets there, he finds that at first it was all he had hoped for and more. Then gradually, over time, things start to change for the worse, until he finds himself sharing his meals with pigs. The thing with this story, though, that always gets me and hits me is the actions of the father. There he is, sitting, waiting, certain that his son will come back to him. And then, when he sees his outline appear on the horizon, he doesn't take the moral high ground. He doesn't stand on the doorstep with his arms folded, waiting to say, "I told you so." No. He gets up and he runs to meet his son, to get to him first and throw his arms around him. Just as Hosea did with his wife, and just as God did with Israel, each time they turned away from him in favour of other gods. However, the closing verse of our reading in Hosea this morning points to that something more than a simple restoration of God's relationship with Israel. It hinted at something far more world-changing. This love letter from God isn't just for Israel. It's a love letter written for the world. Remember, I told you that God chose to use Hosea's life as a living parable and prophetic symbol. Even his children played a part in it. His 3 children were given specific names: Jezreel, Lo Ruhamah, and Lo Ami. I'm apologising if I get them wrong. Jezreel in Hebrew means scattered. Not long after Hosea, gave God's message to the kingdom of Israel, they were taken into exile and scattered across the nations. God was planting his people in the land. Lo ruamah in Hebrew means no mercy. And yet God says in verse 23 of our reading today, I will show mercy to the one I called not my loved one. Our translation this morning uses the word love. The other nations of the world were the ones that were not loved. We are part of those nations. God is saying he will show us his mercy, his love. How do we know? Because of the name of that third child, Lo Ami, which in Hebrew means not my people. Through Hosea, his life, and his family, God is not only showing us, but telling us this morning that he longs for a relationship with each and every one of us. We may not come from his chosen people, but he still wants to know us. We may not have been the loved ones, but he wants to love us just the same. On returning, the prodigal son was welcomed back with open arms and forgiving arms, despite what he had done and what he had cost the father. Just as Hosea was willing to pay whatever it would cost to redeem his wife and pay off her debts, so God was willing to pay whatever price was needed to save his people. All of his people. He knows that we're all guilty of being promiscuous. He knows that we're easily tempted and enslaved by other suitors such as ambition, money, power, pleasure. Yet he was still willing to pay whatever price, even the ultimate price, to bring us back to him. He was willing to send his one and only son to die on a cross so that we can have that loving, intimate relationship with him. So this morning, as we leave, as we follow him into the wilderness, what words is he going to speak into our hearts? Maybe as we leave, as he allures us to the wilderness, maybe he'll be singing to us, wherever you go, whatever you do, I will be right here waiting for you. Whatever it takes, or how my heart breaks, I will be waiting for you. How will you choose to respond this morning? Amen.